Chair. Thank you, everyone. What I wanted to do in my presentation is step back beyond the questions that are preoccupying you on a day-to-day basis, which ultimately boil down to how do you manage this cyclical oversupply. This is what everyone in the industry spends most of their day trying to think about: demand creation, risk management, deregulation, competition. I don't want to talk about any of that. I wanted to step back and talk a little bit about the role of gas in what we now call the energy transition. And in particular, there is a general assumption that people in this room and the gas industry makes, which is that the transition to cleaner energy, low carbon energy, will be good for natural gas. When you look at the future, gas has a bright future in the world's energy mix. So what I wanted to do is challenge some of the assumptions that inform that outlook. In particular, I want to focus on three questions. And most of my presentation is really going to be on the demand side. And the reason is, I think generally the industry does a much better job of focusing on supply than it does on demand. And demand has a tendency to surprise. And so I wanted to talk about demand. The first question I want to ask is, how should we think about overall energy consumption and whether or not our view of growing energy consumption is consistent with the data? The second thing I want to talk about is how quickly might a transition to new energies come about? And lastly, I want to talk about the role of gas in a carbon-constrained future. And when I bring all these things together, what I really want to end on is, I think, the need for companies and organizations that are close to the customer to think very differently about their role in this business and the type of business models that they need to employ in an era of demand uncertainty. Okay? That's what I want to do. So let's start off talking about energy demand. And very simply, the consensus is, in the world, energy demand in the OECD is flat, will be flat, maybe will decline slightly, and that the growth is going to come from the non-OECD. And that's, very simply the consensus sort of long-term structural view that we have. So the first thing I want to do is sort of go through that view and challenge it a little bit. This is a picture of the world in three colors. Red means that in that country, energy demand per capita peaked before 2007. In the yellow, energy demand per capita peaked between 2008 and 2012. In other words, energy demand peaked, but we're not really sure if it's cyclical or structural. It may have been, a weak economy. It may have been other temporary factors. And the green is countries where energy demand has kept growing and where the latest data that we have, energy consumption per capita is at the highest point ever. What I think is striking about this image is, first, how much red there is in the world, right? That about half of the world's energy is consumed in countries where per capita energy use peaked before 2007, and that a quarter of the world's population lives in those places. That, I think, is generally well known, although I don't think just how much red there is generally understood. What is striking to me is how much there is that's also yellow. Countries where energy demand has stopped growing over the last 5-6 years for a number of reasons. That's about 17% of the world's energy market, and it's about 22% of the world's population. And really only about 37% of the world's energy is consumed in countries where per capita consumption keeps growing, and only half of the world lives in those countries. So if you look at this picture, what I really take away is this idea of, flat consumption in OECD, growing non-OECD, doesn't look very right. There's a lot more going on here when you look at those countries. So what I wanted to do now is I wanted to zoom in on those red countries, the countries where energy consumption per capita peaked before 2007. And this is a complicated chart, but it's actually a very simple chart once you have a map. It shows per capita energy consumption and per capita GDP. And it's indexed to 1990, right? So 100 is 1990. And what is meant to show you is, broadly speaking in the world, we tend to think about energy consumption and incomes more or less in the way that, say, a Spain or an Italy looks. Long-term, rising incomes lead to rising energy consumption. That is the perspective that we have. And at some point, you reach a maturity level, and then energy consumption may flatten out. That is essentially what your chief economists will tell you energy consumption looks like. However, when you look at the data, what you see is something very, very different. You have some places where that's true. Spain, Italy, Japan is in a certain degree true. You have other places like the former Soviet Union where GDP and energy have completely delinked after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You have places like many in the Middle East where generally energy consumption grows faster than per capita incomes, and that's an effort to essentially use energy to create economic development and generally fail to do so. But then there are countries where the link between energy consumption and income has never really worked. If you look at, say, the United States, per capita energy consumption peaked in 1978. My favorite example is the United Kingdom down there in the corner. And what's fascinating about the United Kingdom is energy consumption in 2014 and 2015 has been so low that you need to find data outside the BP statistical review to find a year where energy consumption was so low. And the BP statistical review goes back to 1965. So in 2014 and 2015, the UK used less energy than at any point since 1965. And if you go look for that earlier data, you see that the UK consumes on a per capita basis about what it did in 1960. Even though, as you can see, GDP, even though it hasn't recovered to its pre-crisis level, is significantly higher. I mean, relative to 1990, it's about 40% higher. Relative to the 1970s, it's double, right? So my point is that even before the advent of technology and big data and all the innovations that are happening, we've had a relatively complicated link between energy consumption and per capita incomes. And I think what you'll see is the emergence of new technology will break down that link further. And we've learned, not just in the OECD, but all over the world, that countries are able to grow really without consuming that much more energy. So that's the first thing I wanted to put out there. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the transition to new energies. And here, I think the consensus, again, is relatively simple. The consensus that says the transitions to energies, to new energies, tend to be slow. They tend to take a long time, and really, if you look at the world for the next 30 or 40 years, fossil fuels are here to stay. Open up the presentation of any major oil company, and what I just said is verbatim what they will tell you. The problem is that while this is true, that statement is true on a global level, it's not really true on a country level. So here's, again, a relatively complicated picture that makes a lot of sense once you understand it. So this is the world's 30 largest energy consumers. And this is their fuel mix back to 1965, okay? How much is coming from oil, coal, gas, nuclear, and renewables. The gray is a period where the country has undergone what I call an energy transition. And what an energy transition is a 10 percentage point change in the energy mix over, roughly speaking, a 10-year period. So if you go from, in Argentina on the top left, oil was at 77% in 1965, and it declined all the way to about, 27, 28%. So that is a long-term transition. If you go to the next slide on Australia, there's an energy transition that happens in the 60s and 70s, and there's another one that happens as you substitute away coal in the 2000s. What I find striking about this image is how many gray boxes there are. That even though, in general, on a global scale, it takes for a long time for new energies to come to the market, what we see here is when there is an impetus, either policy or new technology, when governments want something to happen, or when there's a new resource available that can undercut existing fuels, the transitions can actually be very, very fast and very dramatic. I mean, going from 75% to 50% or 40% or 30% is a massive change over a relatively short period of time. If you take this image and you sort of summarize it, what we have is, in the 30 largest energy consumers, about 50 episodes of quote-unquote energy transitions. They tend to last for about a decade, right? There's a decade-long period where one fuel is significantly losing market share. The average change is about 20 percentage points, so going from 60% to 40%. And then you can see some of the other numbers in terms of ranges and all that. Usually what we've seen is oil and coal are the dominant fuels that have lost. And when coal has lost, it's usually lost to oil and a little bit less so to gas. When oil has lost, really any other fuel has gained. Sometimes it's coal, sometimes it's gas, sometimes it's nuclear, sometimes it's hydro. But I think really the takeaway that I want you to take from this is, yes, on a global scale, the penetration of renewables is going to be slow or maybe not as quick as some people hope. But when there is determined government action and when there is a push, either technological or new resource becomes available, the transition can be very, very dramatic. And in particular, I think in today's world where fossil fuels, especially in Europe and North America, have lost much of their legitimacy. I'm talking political legitimacy. When you say you work in oil, gas, or coal in Europe or North America, people look at you in a slightly better way than they look at people who work in the tobacco industry, right? And that's unfortunate, but it's true, right? And so when there is this push to move away from fossil fuels, we shouldn't underestimate how quickly change can happen. The last thing I want to talk about is the role of gas in a carbon-constrained world. And here again, I think the consensus view says two things. One, if you want to do something about the environment, you have to use more gas. Why? First, because gas is cleaner, and secondly, that gas can be a good partner to renewables. That renewables are intermittent, sometimes the wind doesn't blow, sometimes the sun doesn't shine, and gas is a great partner for renewables. That is the view. The truth, again, is slightly more complicated. If you look at the same image that I had before, but now the colors, red is a country where the share of gas in the energy mix peaked before 2007. Yellow is a country where the share of gas in the energy mix peaked between 2007 and 2012. And green is a place where the share of gas was at an all-time high at the latest data point. And what's striking to me, and I consider myself a natural gas person, there's so few green countries in the world. I mean, the world is full of yellow and red, places where gas was at its peak a long, long time ago, or gas was at its peak recently, but it has really struggled to maintain its market share, right? So if you look at the world in this way, there's no clear long-term move towards natural gas, right? In fact, what you see is for most of the world, natural gas is really struggling to grow its market share. And the last thing I wanted to put on this is what I find striking when people talk about the fact that the transition to renewable energy has to be good for natural gas. What strikes me is that the only place where countries have made a concerted effort to switch to renewable energy, the only place in the world where this has happened is Europe. And in Europe, the growth of renewables has been absolutely devastating for natural gas. If you look over the last 10 years, gas has lost about 100 billion cubic meters of consumption. And as a consultant who spent this entire time looking at the European gas market, the argument was always, well, this year was bad, but next year it's going to be better, it's going to recover. And then next year came and it wasn't better, and we said, okay, maybe in 2 years it's going to recover. And then the next year came and we kept saying that. And what you see across the board, and you heard already talk about Germany and other places, but really this is a pan-European phenomenon. What you generally see is the red, which is gas, and the blue, which is renewables, being inversely correlated. The more you have renewables coming in, it generally tends to hit gas. And what I find particularly interesting, and Alan talked about this, is when you look at the question of intermittency, the assumption is renewables are intermittent, gas is flexible, gas should complement renewables. That's the theory. The problem is that that's not really what happens. When you look at intermittency, in Europe, it is managed through gas, through coal, and through imports and exports. Gas really doesn't have any particular benefit in countering intermittency. Now, you may say technically it should, and you'd be right, but it doesn't, right? So I'm talking about what actually happens versus what should happen. And that's why what you've generally seen, renewables come in, they add sort of a zero marginal cost fuel in the mix, and they push out the most expensive fuel, and that tends to be gas. So when I look at this, the one place where you have a very aggressive transition to renewable energy, the number one fuel that has lost out is natural gas. And there's lots of reasons for that. There's carbon policy. There's lots of things we can talk about. But broadly speaking, this doesn't give me comfort to think that a transition to low carbon energy should necessarily benefit natural gas. So let's try to bring all these three things together. One, energy demand may grow, may not, and in fact we're seeing several countries, the UK is my favorite one, where there are actual serious declines in energy consumption while economies are growing. The transition to new energies may be faster, especially if governments are committed to it. And the share of natural gas, it's not a given at all that it's going to grow in the energy mix. So when you bring all these things together, we see challenging the question of the growth of energy demand, challenging the question of what the role of gas is going to be in the transition to new energies, and challenging this perception that gas should benefit in a carbon-constrained world. What does that leave you with? And this is my last slide. I'm going to end on this. What we have is a very long-term business. Most of you here deal with 10, 20, 30, 40-year horizons. And it's really difficult to have a 30, 40-year mindset if you live in a world where energy transitions can happen in 10, 15 years, and your market can be completely reshaped. The other thing that I find fascinating is that if you look at the history of the gas business, so much of the gains that gas has made in fuel mix have generally come from fuel switching, and in particular against oil, where in a way the gas business created an automatic competitiveness against oil by using oil indexation. And so in a way the system of pricing and the system of thought of how the business has developed has really been built to displace oil. And now it's much harder to deal with coal or renewables because the risk management toolkit hasn't really been built to push gas against those kind of energies. And I think in that environment, one of the things that is happening, and I think we'll see more of it happening, is that if you have demand uncertainty, a long-term contract may be a liability more than an asset. And I realize that here we have a big dichotomy between sort of the Asian side of the room, where this statement may seem outrageous, and the European side of the room, where that's essentially what a lot of the European utilities suffered through in the last 10 years. And the final thing I wanted to finish on is, at the end of the day, and I realize that this is going to sound like an outrageous statement, but the demand for energy, I always think of is zero. No one cares about energy. No one wants energy. No one wants oil. No one wants gas. No one wants coal. What we want is to be warm and cool and want to move around and charge our phones and go on the internet. And when we think about the customer in that way, what we realize is the customer doesn't value the commodity. The customer values what they get from the commodity. And what I think is really happening is there's an entire business that is outside of this room that is trying to think about how do we meet the needs of the customer without necessarily providing them a commodity. You know, I think about my situation. I live in Washington, D.C. You know, the main source of energy insecurity for me is the fact that I can't control the temperature in my office, so I'm always freezing. So I'm wearing a sweater. That's energy efficiency in America. I'm wearing a sweater in the summer because it's very cold. And when I go home in the wintertime, my window leaks, right? And so it's freezing if I sit at the couch next to the window. Now, what the solution is, provide more commodity. I don't really want more commodity. I want a thermostat, and I want a new window. And I think when you start approaching energy from that perspective, you come to very different conclusions about what the customer wants and what someone who's close to the customer should be preparing for as we make this transition to new energy. Thank you.